Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. Today, I'm honoured to be joined by Nathan Whitaker. But before we get into the podcast, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before I get back to Duke this fall, so please do everything you can. Nathan Whitaker is a best-selling New York Times author, the former director of legal affairs for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the former senior manager of football administration at the Jacksonville Jaguars, a graduate of Harvard Law School and Duke University, and is now both a speaker and a coach. So, Nathan, thank you very much for joining me today. I wanted to get started by asking you why you got interested in law in the first place. You know, you've been a football player at Duke. Why go into law?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here, and that's a funny opening question because I feel like I did everything I could to avoid law in some ways. Oh, well, I guess going to law school really isn't much of an avoidance. But yes, I was recruited to play baseball at Duke, walked onto the football team, wasn't going to have a career path in either one of those as a player. And so trying to figure out what to do next, and was an English and political science major. And so couldn't figure out what to do with that. So I took the LSAT. My dad practiced law here in Gainesville, Florida, where I grew up. For a long time, and was pretty sure I didn't want to be a lawyer. I appreciated what he did. I respected what he did, but wasn't sure. So I took the LSAT, and then I was going to take the GRE, then I was going to take the GMAT, and I was going to figure out grad school and what you do with a law degree. I mean, with an English degree. And the LSAT went really well. And next thing I knew, I was at Harvard. And figured that would just be a good way to continue my education. Next thing I knew, I was clerking for a federal judge and then in a 250 attorney firm in North Carolina, practicing law. And I thought, wait, this was not the plan. So that was kind of how I ended up in law. And it was a really good training as far as thinking through things. And, you know, the running joke here in the house is I usually don't have the better arguments with my wife, or at least the better points. But she laughs and she says, you know, what you learned in law school is we'll have this discussion, and I'll be like, okay, I've got 3 points. And she's like, you learned to enumerate everything. I don't know if you learned any good arguments, but you learned to enumerate everything. So anyway, that's a long answer to how law and why law.
Yeah, I don't think you're ever going to be able to win an argument against your wife, even if you did go to Harvard Law.
Right.
But at least you can put numbers on it.
Right.
How did your legal training shape you and how you now approach storytelling and leadership in general?
So I do think it was a helpful background. In addition to just learning to enumerate things, it did help me break apart cases, break apart stories, figure out where the pieces were, and that was part of the training. You know, as heavily Socratic. Back when I went to law school in the early 1990s, and you know, you have a professor standing there, Mr. Whitaker, what do you think about this case? And you're having to think through the case and the arguments and what's there and what's buried in there and what facts I can try to assume. And you learn quickly not to assume any facts and not to bring anything in. And it's either there or it's not. And so in trying to understand the stories and what kind of stood behind the principles and the rules of law, you kind of figure out, all right, where are the facts and where are things going? And you know, we talk about hard cases making or hard stories making bad law. And at times the facts take you in one direction or another. And so I think I learned first as an English major, but then a little bit in my reading of the law, this idea of the story really matters, and where you're going and how you've set it up and what you've put in and what you leave out matters. And so you've got to be careful about making sure you've left out only what you mean to leave out. And there needs to be a reason if you do. So I think that kind of colored my approach to things as a storyteller.
So kind of having had that background, you've been a dual spiel athlete at Duke. You've obviously done very well going to Harvard Law, and that would be a great career in and of itself. But then you transitioned back into the world of football, reaching some very senior positions. Why football? How did you make an impact? And how much influence do you have as someone practicing law within a football organization?
Yeah, so I was trying to figure out how to get back in sports, and I was practicing civil litigation. So I was in a huge firm in North Carolina, great folks, great attorneys, really did things very well and ethically and really very methodical and provided great service for their clients. And I am by nature a conflict avoider. And so this idea that I was in litigation, that I was dealing with lawsuits, and that I had clients who needed me to act zealously on their behalf, I realized that just put me in conflict a lot of times with folks, and I didn't enjoy it. And so the running joke is that most people say that, estate planning and helping figure out their wills and trusts and all that is kind of dull. I wonder if I'd gone into that, if I'd still be practicing law, because being an introvert and not enjoying conflict, I might have loved that. But instead, I headed down this path of practicing law and was trying to figure out, how do I get back in sports? And so I wrote to a number of organizations. I interviewed at the NCAA and talked to the Kansas City Royals for a bit. But really the first opening that somebody had that made sense for me was with the Jaguars. And so they brought me on board, and I really didn't do much in the way of legal work with the Jaguars. My legal training helped because I negotiated contracts and the like, but we had other folks in the organization who were negotiating contracts who didn't have any legal training. And we had one of the early partners of the Jaguars was also an attorney. So he kind of handled the legal work. And so I was free to do football administration. So I was doing budgeting and assisting with scouting and some other things in addition to salary cap work. So it freed me up to do a variety of things. And that was kind of fun, to be working more on the football side of things and not doing as much legal work as I'd done before.
I think as a fan and someone outside the football industry, or really any industry, the big emphasis is on what's the team doing on the field. But there's oftentimes not enough emphasis on the people that are making it all happen behind the scenes. What are some of the biggest leadership lessons you took from your time working in these great football teams in your roles?
Well, it was a great chance to learn a lot of leadership lessons that I'm still applying now as in my role as a speaker and writing books and the like. I did get to see a number of leaders up close and personal. And, one of the coaches I played for at Duke was Steve Spurrier. And then got to work for Tom Coughlin in Jacksonville, got to work for Tony Dungy in Tampa Bay, and then got to work for John Gruden in Tampa Bay. So saw a variety of different styles and approaches. And that was one of the things that I think was just a very clear lesson to me, was that all those folks had very different styles. Coach Spurrier is very demonstrative. Coach Coughlin really admired George Patton and had a bunch of Patton books all over his office and photos. And Coach Coughlin was very clear and regimented, and here's how he did things. Tony had a much more laid-back approach in how he did things. And then Coach Gruden was very excitable and really brought a great amount of energy. And so this idea that leaders can have different styles, that when we become a leader, when we try to move an organization, to have influence on people, sometimes we'll look and say, well, Coach so-and-so does it a certain way, or this CEO that I really admire does it this way, so let me do that. And it may make sense to take on some traits or to try to grow in some areas that maybe you're not as strong. But I think when we try to push aside our personality and say, well, I'm going to take somebody else's on, that just doesn't work, at least not for long, that it's not sustainable, that we maybe can lead for a while acting as somebody else, but after a while it doesn't work anymore. It's not authentic. And so I think it's much more important to be who we are. And so just seeing those four coaches, those four styles was really illustrative to me early in my career, to see those different leadership styles.
Yeah, a lot of coaching is within an organization, and you're enabled to act in the way that you want to, in terms of telling people to do this, or have a coaching style or authoritative type style, or whatever style you choose, because those people are sort of bound to the club. But I feel like scouting is quite unique, and recruiting, because you're in a position in which you're trying to develop a relationship with a player, but there's also an element of having to be overly nice or overly open, in a sense that you have to get them to commit to the team in the first place before you can even get them to coach, before you can even coach them within the organization. In your role as sort of being a scout for these teams, what would you look for? Because when I look at sport in the UK, it's often seen as this person has a really good mindset. They have, in rugby, they have a good step, they have a good pass, they have a good understanding of the game. But when a lot of my friends talk about American sports, in particular American football, it's this guy is this many pounds and he's this height and he has this jump and he has this reach. And so I see that. But then on the contrary, I see what happened with Shedeur Sanders, and it's more of an attitude-based thing. So as a scout, what would you look for? Is it purely metrics-based? Is it potential-based? Like, how would that formulate in your mind? And how do you, determine between someone that has all the right metrics but no it won't transfer to someone not having the right metrics that it will transfer. Could you talk to me a bit about that?
Sure. So there's obviously different ways of going about this. And if you don't mind, we'll just set aside the Sanders example, because there's so much noise coming from there as far as was it really were these outside elements really factoring in, or was there something else? And frankly, having written a book with Tim Tebow and watching him with the Broncos, and then trying to catch on with other teams, it also was hard to tell at times there whether there was outside noise that was influencing these teams and what they wanted to do and how they were going to build their roster. But all that matters at some level, and all that factors in, because I do think that the metrics matter, right? That at some point, if you're a defensive end and you're 6'6", and Simeon Rice was one of our players in Tampa Bay, and he's just been named to be in the Buccaneers Ring of Honor as one of the all-time greats. Simeon Rice was 6'5" and 245 pounds, and unbelievably fast, and just incredible quickness. And so to have those abilities is certainly sets you aside from most of the population, right? And that's critical to have a certain level of physical giftedness. At the same time, though, I think the non-tangibles, the intangibles matter a lot too, in that, how hard are you going to practice? Are you somebody that we're going to have to worry about the night before games, that you're trying to sneak somebody into the hotel or you're trying to sneak yourself out, or whatever it may be? And are you going to be somebody we can depend on? That are you going to, we'd have players at times who would, on a third and whatever situation on defense, they'd think, I'll bet I can guess where this ball's going to go. And all of a sudden they're out of position. It's a big gain. And you're thinking, I don't want somebody who's going to guess at a critical moment. I want somebody who's going to do what we need you to do. And so trying to figure out where all those intangibles factor can be hard. When I was in Tampa under Tony Dungy, we actually had a category, DNDC, and it was do not draft because of character. So do not draft character issues. And so we'd have people who were going to go in the first round, and we would take them completely off our board. That we'd have a spot where we thought that, we thought they're the sixth best player in the draft or whatever, but we'd have a notation that we're not going to take them and it doesn't matter. And our owner one time came into the draft, and Tony had told them his concept and he wanted to implement it. They said, fine. The owner walks in on draft day and says, wait a minute, you mean we're not going to take so-and-so even if they fought us? And Tony said, no. And they said, well, what if he gets drafted within our division? We're going to have to play him twice a year. And Tony's line was, I'd rather have to confront them twice a year than have to deal with them 365 days in my locker room. And so it was that question of, how talented they are and the like, but then at the same time, figuring out, and I think it's like that in companies as well, figuring out, who the person is and can I rely on them, and are they going to do the hard things, or are they just going to show up and be physically gifted? And, one of the things you see as you get higher up in levels in sport, but also in other organizations, some of the things that were easy when you were just better than everybody are no longer easy, right? Because everybody's incredibly physically gifted. And we're friends, got to know Billy Donovan well, former University of Florida coach who's now with the Chicago Bulls, but being a Gainesville guy, got to know Billy. And there was a game years ago, Florida was playing Arizona, and Florida was ranked top 10 or something, and lost to Arizona because they couldn't get the ball in bounds in the last minute of the game or something. They had a 5-point lead, and 2 or 3 times in a row couldn't get the ball in bounds. Arizona comes back to win. And I remember Billy saying after the game, you know what, that's my fault, because we haven't practiced that hard enough, because their whole lives they've been able to just take a step or two and get open because they're bigger, they're faster, they're stronger, whatever. And Billy said, I took it for granted. Billy's 5'11" or whatever he is, and ended up playing in the NBA a little bit. And Billy's like, I made it to the NBA because I would grab somebody's jersey or move off them on a screen and really come off them hard and rub. And he's like, I just assumed that everybody would do that. Why would I assume that? These guys are so much more physically gifted than I am. So the next day in practice, all they did was working on getting the ball in bounds. And it was this really physical practice about, you're going to have to really work to get open. So anyway, all that is to say that at some point we get to a place in our life where everybody around us is really physically gifted as well. And so are we willing to do some of the things that they're not willing to do to get better and to do things? And that was part of what we tried to figure out along the way. It's hard to do. One of the things that our scouts would always do was to go in, when they'd go in and make college visits, they'd talk to the position coach and, talking to the running backs coach about, tell me about this running back and what do you think about this? What do you think about them? But before they'd leave, they'd always go to the strength coach, and they'd always talk to the strength coach and say, okay, tell me about this player. Were they on time? Did they come in every time they were supposed to be here? Did they come in times when they weren't supposed to be here? Would they actually work hard, or did they just check the box to say they showed up in the weight room? And that was one of the areas that it kept showing up was, it's one thing to, as you mentioned, talk about the on-field stuff and the performance on the field, but are you willing to do the things all along the way? And so trying to figure that out was always a challenge, right? In any area of life, it's always a challenge to figure those things out. But that was part of what we tried to do.
Having not grown up in the US, I'm not as much of a basketball ball of knowledge, shall we say. But I did unfortunately see the Duke Final Four, and that inbounding situation reminded me quite a lot of that.
Right. That happened. It happened just this year to Duke. It's a tough thing, right? And it's tough moment of the game, and you've got to be able to. I'm sure that Coach Shire has given a lot of thought to that over the last month. Yeah,
I was devastated. I don't know if I fully knew what was going on the whole time, but I knew something was going wrong at that point in time.
Right. Right.
On the point with regard to being a good egg, bad egg, good character, bad character, I want to go down that route a bit further, because I feel like there's an extent to which these NFL coaches, they're earning millions of dollars, they're praised by their communities, these cult-like followings, and so sort of what they decide to do, it's like, okay, it might work, it might not. That's just part of their rules. It's part of the traditions that they have. It's part of their morals, how they bring up their team, and so that's why they wouldn't bring that player. But I was wondering if we could go a bit more detail on how big of a repercussion it would have to have a bad egg in a team, because a lot of NFL players have quite big personalities. They're earning millions. They're loud. So what would it matter to have another? I'm not saying all people like this, but to have someone that's obnoxious and stuff, but does really well on the field. What are the actual consequences of having someone like that when there's 100 other players in the team?
Yeah, and so it's a challenge, right? Because some of these players do have really outsized personalities, and that doesn't always mean that they're a bad teammate. I think part of what we're looking for in terms of character is who's going to make the people around them better, and who's going to be a hindrance to everyone else. And so, can I rely on somebody to do their assignment? Can I rely on somebody to make the most of their own potential? Can I rely on this person to, if the ball's not coming their way, can I rely on them to do the other things that are required? For instance, if it's the stories are legion of running backs who on a passing play don't want to block, right? It's a lot of times if they're blocking to pick up a blitz, right? It's a running back, and it might be a guy who's 5'10", 5'11", 6 feet tall, and 200 something pounds, trying to take on a linebacker who's several inches and 40 pounds heavier. And their running backs will say, hey, whoa, I'm here to carry the ball, right? I'm here to run. I am not here to block. And so you kind of at times find out the hard way, is somebody willing to do that? And so I think at some level, you can have folks who are brash and have big personalities, but when their teammates see, they're going to step up and do the little things, and they're going to have my back. And, they may say crazy things in the paper, but it's no big deal. Or there are times when it might be, right? There are comments we see where you think, oh my gosh, did you? And the player will apologize, but everybody knows they're not really sincere with that. So now we do have some bad blood in the locker room, right? And so we have some issues, because at the end of the day, we're all human, and we're trying to work through that and figure all that out. And so I think that's part of the question is, big personalities isn't necessarily always a bad thing. But the question is then, exactly what are we looking for, and how are they going to be in the locker room around their teammates? Are they going to prepare? And it's not always an easy thing to figure out. One of the great examples we had in Tampa was Warren Sapp. And for those who are older, defensive tackle, came out around 1994 out of the University of Miami and was drafted by the Bucs and was a really big personality. And he was one of those where, if he's your guy, you love him. And if you're any other fan of any other team, you can't stand him. And Warren was just always loud and big and brash but a great player. And he worked really hard every single day. And he was telling me one time that he had, as I mentioned, come out of the University of Miami. And he said when he first got on campus at Miami, they had great teams at the time. This is in the 80s or late 80s when they were winning national championships and just dominant. And he said he was in the weight room as a freshman. And some of the upperclassmen came to him and said, "Hey, get out of here." He said, "What do you mean? I'm lifting." And they said, "Well, you're talking as much as you're lifting. And at Miami, when we come in the weight room, we're here to do a job. When we go on the field, we're here to do a job. And so, you need to do that job, and you're not willing to do it right now. So get out of the weight room and come back at a time when you're focused and willing to work hard." And it made a huge impression on Warren at the age of 18. He was probably 28 at the time. He was telling me the story. And he became one of the upperclassmen who policed the locker room. And he said, we didn't have to have coaches around telling us what to do because we took care of it, because we built the culture and we understood what the culture needed and carried it on. And so we did the same thing in Tampa. So opposing fans would see Warren and think, "Oh my gosh, what a loudmouth, what a showboat, what a whatever." But at the same time, he was one of those who worked really hard every day in practice. And if we had guys come in and weren't willing to work hard, he would go to them first. And if it wasn't taken care of, he'd go to the coaches and say, "Hey, we've got a problem. This person's not living up to our standards." So when you talk about character and you talk about personalities and the like, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. It's not always what we think about as fans when we think about, "Oh, that person must be a pain," or all that. It's actually, that person ended up being a great teammate, even though you might think as an outsider that maybe they weren't. So,
yeah, it's also the bit about this. There's a bit of showmanship in the game of football as well, and loud-mouthing people, getting on their nerves, getting in their head as part of the game. I want to transition back to the example you gave of your 5'11" friend and your 6'5" friend, one of which was amazing in football and the other one amazing in basketball. I think within football it's one thing, and we've kind of talked about what it takes to be successful, being minimally, have a minimum natural gift that once you reach the NFL, it's the key differentiator is how hard you're willing to work and immerse yourself into that culture. But a lot of your focus nowadays is on speaking, which I want to focus more on later in the podcast. But on that point, with the 6'5" guy in football, the 5'11" one in basketball, there's often that question with entrepreneurship and in life of whether you're born an entrepreneur or you're born successful or if you're made successful. Like I saw Scott Galloway on a podcast the other day, he was saying that most of his success merely comes from where he was born. So he was born in the 1960s in California. He's white. It was a time when it was booming. I want to ask you that same question. If you think for people in their own lives that want to take control of their life, that want to be successful, that want to do these things in sport, music, business, anything, of whether they're just innately either going to be successful or not, or whether you think they really have the ability to change their lives or to fulfill their destiny in a sense to become the people that they were supposed to become.
Wow. Well, that's certainly a huge question. I think so. Let me first acknowledge, right, that as you said, Scott said, and I haven't seen the quote, but I mean, there's certainly a lot of us who were born into circumstances that, one of my buddies in Tampa Bay said things were melting down and we didn't know if we were all going to be fired or whatever, and things looked rough, and he said, "Nathan, you're born into a certain kind of family, and then you went to Duke, and then you went to Harvard." He's like, you had a 14-point lead in life when the rest of us were just scrambling to keep our head above water. And then he joked and said, "Now we're 7 points behind because we were looking at all being fired." But anyway, but certainly there are huge advantages that some of us have that are just built in. I do think, though, that entrepreneurship, I actually got a master's about 15 years ago through the University of Florida here in town in entrepreneurship. So it was through the business school, and so I studied that a fair amount, and And I do think there are a lot of qualities kind of that we were talking about earlier, some of these intangibles where, yes, there are people who are really smart and have a great mind for things. One of my coworkers in Tampa would just always have business ideas, and he was just wired to look for those. And he'd go to get gas, and he's like, you know what, we could pitch this product, and we could have ads on the pumps, and we could have all of which we have now, right? But it was 10 years before anybody thought to do that. And we're laughing at him going, who's going to watch a TV ad that's on the side as I pump gas? I'm not watching that. And of course we are now. And so there are some people who are just kind of maybe wired that way. But at the same time, there's something to be said for sticking with it, continuing to being willing to take a risk, right? I think that's a huge part of entrepreneurship, that a lot of us just kind of are willing to go about our business and figure and keep working for the next paycheck. And there are folks who are out there going, I'm going to cut the ties, right? And I'm going to go off and try something new and try to create a product in a market that maybe isn't exactly there yet, and hope the customers will follow me. And so it takes tenacity and resilience and being clever and quick on your feet. And then at times figuring out, when is stubbornness a virtue and when is it not? And when are the times to change and say, okay, this idea didn't work and it's time to pivot and go somewhere else. So I do think that, probably to Scott's point, there are certain people that are just probably in positions where they've got a lot of advantages. But then there are a lot of other folks too, a lot of great stories of folks who didn't have any and figured out, you know what, I'm going to figure out a way to make this work. And they did. So I think it kind of takes all types in some ways.
There are two main sort of quotes/sayings that sort of come to mind in response to what you said. The first one being control the controllables. So this is something one of two things my parents have always told me. But I actually did a podcast with a guy called Tim Henman, who reached number 4 in the world for tennis. He's been to Wimbledon, semi-final 4 times. He's won 12 or 13 ATP titles, $12 million in prize money. And his point was that, in a game of tennis, whether you've won the point before or you've lost it, it doesn't really matter. Just focus on the next point, focus on what you can control and not on what you can't control. And the reason that kind of comes to mind for this is you might be Bill Gates' son, or you might have been the kid, or you might be an orphan. And the point is to say that, sure, you might have started higher up the ladder or lower down the ladder, but all you can do at that point in time is be your best, develop your morals, work hard. Even for the football example, when you're at the top of the chain, it looks like you've made it. You have to work your ass off to get into those positions. And the other second quote my parents used to tell me, and I wear a necklace around my neck, which says be the best you can be. And this podcast, Personable, is learning from the world's best, such as yourself, to become the best you can be. And the reason it's be the best you can be is I think it's not just be the best. There's only going to be 1% or 0.1% who are going to be quite literally the best in the world. But you can become from the 70th percent to the 2%. You can become from not fit in the gym to fitter. You can become from, not doing well in business to doing better. You can save more money. And I think that's a perspective which I take with me every day, because I think comparison is a thief of joy. And while it's good to have the perspective where other people are, it's only by focusing on yourself internally and how can I be better, that's where the true growth comes from.
I think that's absolutely right. Comparison is the thief of joy is such a great quote, and it's so easy to do, because there's always somebody else out there doing something. And then now in this day and age, you kind of knew it back in the day when I was growing up, but you certainly know it every moment as people post what they're doing, what cool and interesting things they're doing. But I think what you said is right. Back to the prior question, but tying it in with your point, being a Duke guy as well. There's no greater example than somebody overcoming failure than right down the road, Michael Jordan in Chapel Hill, right? He's cut from his junior varsity team in 10th grade or 9th grade, whichever it was, and he spends all summer working, and an amazing story of persistence and resilience. At the same time, he's becoming the best he can be. I feel like at times we probably burden 9th and 10th graders who have just been cut with their junior varsity team going, hey, if you'll just practice enough, if you'll just work hard enough this next summer, you can be Michael Jordan. Well, they're not, right? They're just not. There's only one Michael. And he was wired a certain way and gifted athletically a certain way. And then he worked like crazy and had an incredible mindset. And And so at times when we sit there and think, well, if I work hard enough, then I can be person X, maybe. But the reality is if I work hard enough, I can be the best Nathan I can be. And I've got certain gifts and abilities, and I may never measure up to all the things you're doing, but I can at least be better in my areas and get the most out of whatever it is I've got. And I think there's really something to be said for that, maximizing our potential and figuring out the best that we can be along the way is, I think, really important. It's probably the only goal that really makes sense.
Yeah, well, even as an extension of that, they could be a Scottie Pippen or someone like that. Like, even if they're not the Michael Jordan, there's still a billion people within that are still doing amazingly well. I want to transition a little bit to your work as an author. I can see many
Before
of
we
your
go,
books
let me make one other point though. Before we go, even if you don't become Pippen, even if you get cut the next year from the team, if you've done all you can do and taken a risk and tried and failed, I think there's something to be said for that. Even trying, right? I mean, I'd be curious to see what George Lucas with the old Star Wars movies has said. I've never seen it, but everybody loves the Yoda quote, "Do or do not, there is no try." And I get that, right? There's something to be said for accomplishment and achievement and winning, and the point is to win. But at the same time, there's something to be said for trying. And a lot of people never try. And they never maximize their potential because they're afraid to fail. And sometimes it's failing over and over, whether it's Gates or Musk or Jobs or whatever. They fail over and over. And then you catch a break, something works out. Well, partly it's because you just keep throwing things against the wall and eventually something sticks. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'd go ahead and ask your next question, but I did want to...
I think that was very valuable. And I just want to add to that. I feel like there's a misconception that when you fail, it's like this, oh, you've gone bankrupt and you've lost your home and you've lost this. It's actually just these mini things that didn't quite go as planned. And you can take those mini learnings. I saw a very interesting Instagram post the other day. And it was saying that when you're reading something, like you're reading something hard or learning a new subject, you feel stupid in the inside because you're like, on the inside, because you feel like, oh, I don't understand anything that's happening here. But actually, that's when you're learning. Or it's like, let's say you're playing sport with a better athlete than you. You feel like you're an idiot. Like, oh, I can't score any points. I can't run fast them. I can't keep up with the drills. But that's actually when you're getting fitter and you're getting better at basketball or tennis or football or rugby or whatever it is. It's in that moment that when you tried and you failed, that's when you can be slightly better the next time. And I think that's so invaluable.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I got nothing to add to that. That's exactly right. That you're changing your brain wiring and you're growing, even in those moments where it didn't work out.
So you've gone to amazing schools. You've got an amazing career. My dad once said something to me. He said, if you're doing so well, you as in not you, as in just like broad you, are doing so well, why share this knowledge with the world? Like, if you know how to become a billionaire, why share that with the world? If you know how to do this, why do that? So I want to ask you the same question. Like, why did you want to share your knowledge and your learnings with the world? Why was books the medium to do so? And how did you collaborate on books with such amazing people like Tony Dungy and Tim Tebow?
Yeah, so I really have this sense of... I'll try to tease out the answer this way. One is being a person of faith. I really think that to whom much is given, much is expected. And I really am not the product of just I did it all by myself and pulled myself up by the bootstraps. And I had a lot of people help me along the way. And I was given some great opportunities along the way and got into schools that I probably had no business getting into, right? I'm not sure I know I wasn't a Division I athlete, but I was close enough that coaches took a chance on me and I got into Duke, which I wouldn't have gotten into without that. And then I think that probably launched me into Harvard. And so I had these opportunities to go to places that other people would have loved to have gone to. And then that opened doors for me to get in with the Jaguars and then the Bucs. And then I get fired by the Bucs and I'm unemployed for 3 years and I'm trying to talk Tony into writing a book. And they win the Super Bowl and publishers are knocking down his door. And Tony said, either I'm going to do it with Nathan Whitaker. He's never written a book, but he's been talking to me about a book for the last couple of years. So either I'll do it with Nathan or I'm not going to do a book. And so that's how it came to be. And I later said to Tony, all I'd done was salary cap analysis for you. I'd done spreadsheets. I'd done, scouting report type things or hotel contracts or airlines. How did you know I could write? And he said, well, I figured you'd gone to Duke and Harvard, and so you'd figure it out. So again, I found myself going, wow, I'm even 20 years later, I'm still somebody's going, hey, that must count for something. But when you peel it back, you're like, I'm not even sure I was supposed to be in those places. So I had this sense of a lot of people helped me along the way, and a lot of doors opened for me that maybe shouldn't have. So whatever I can do to help other people. And that's a part of what I see when I speak. I really enjoy talking to folks, and whether it's about resilience and some of my challenges where, again, on social media, I look like I've got it all together. And when I speak on resilience, I talk about some of the things that I fall short on even now. There are significant things where I deal with, mental issues and trying to navigate life. And they think, well, I'll get feedback afterwards of folks saying that, we figured you had it all together. And I'm like, we're all just kind of walking each other home. I'm not sure any of us have it all figured out. And so to the extent I can help somebody along the way, whether it's with that, or if I knew how to make $1 billion, maybe I wouldn't share that. But to your point earlier, but whatever I can share, whatever I've figured out along the way, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. I don't think life is. I think we're all just walking each other home. And so if I can share something with you that makes you better, or with your listeners, or with the person down the street or whatever, then that's all great. And I certainly have those people helping me.
Many of your books and the people that you've worked with and spent time with are rare. Like, they're unique people that are the best athletically, some of the smartest people, most creative, most innovative people on the planet. They're, unique almost by nature without even having to do anything. They're unique. And similarly to what you've been able to write about, what do you think these people do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that enables them to get to the points that they're at and to become these incredible human beings? And then by extension, how can my listeners learn from these incredible people to implement routines or exercises or to live their lives in a way that will enable them to become the best they can be?
One of the things I think that people have done that I've studied is that they've taken some chances, whether it's James Brown of CBS Sports having a sales career and deciding that he wanted to be a broadcaster, and so he started doing games for $100 a night or whatever it was, and working a ton of games until he finally caught a break and getting better at his skills in that regard, or whether it was Tony Dungy being willing to change positions and try some different things, and or Tim Tebow and some of the things he did where he was willing to take risks. But at the same time then, even as they took risks, they did what was in front of them, and they did it again the next day, and they just kept working incrementally. That sometimes we think of breakthroughs, I think, as somebody just got up one day and decided to become whatever it was and did it. And I think that's pretty rare. That I think a lot of times people just do the thing that's in front of them, and they keep working at it incrementally, and they get a little bit better today, and they get a little bit better tomorrow. Now, it may not look like a linear path of growth, right? I think a lot of times it's either exponential, or it's probably a little more jagged. If you looked at a line of you can tell I'm not a math person, right? Whatever that would be on a graph. That I think at times we make these leaps, right? Back to your point of people trying things and failing and whatever. And, there's science about our brain wiring changing as we try new things, as we read new things, as we try to study different things. And so it may look like I'm only making a little bit of progress, or it may look like I'm making no progress. But the reality is that maybe I am. And then all of a sudden on day 25, I realize I'm not just a little better at this, I'm a lot better than I was on day 24. And that's not just because I did day 22 work, day 23 work, day 24, but it's because I started at day 1, right? And I did all these things along the way, and all of a sudden you could see some progress. And I may backslide, and I may make more progress. Kind of that idea of the frozen river melting at the end of winter, right? That it's 20 degrees or something, and the ice is still thick, and it's 21 degrees, and the ice is still thick, and it's 22 degrees. Well, finally, when it breaks, it's not the 32 to 33 degree mark that made all the difference. It was also 21, 22, 23, 24. And so I think that's one of the things I've seen over and over from Tim, from Tony, from whatever. They did the next thing in front of them, and they figured out what was the next thing on my plate. What do I need to master? What do I need to work on today? And just keep chipping away at that. And eventually you realize, holy cow, these folks were really good at what they do. But it's because they did a whole lot of stuff that we didn't see along the way.
Kind of as an extension on that coaching point, having seen it both on the field and off the field, what do you think makes a great coach versus a great CEO?
Coach versus a great CEO? The difference between a great coach and a great CEO?
So like a coach is more concerned on what's going on the field, like the battle against another team, whereas like the CEO in this case within a football franchise is focused on how the brand looks. So, they're selling merchandise, how are how are all the people doing their job well, etc.
Got it. Well, I think, I think I think there are a lot more similarities than differences in that I think they both have to focus on what they can control the controllables, if you will. I mean, that the CEO, merchandising, ticket sales, whatever it may be, are going to be dictated in no small part by success, right? That if I'm in the Premier League and I end up getting relegated, the CEO can do everything he or she wants to do to sell tickets, but people are going to be disappointed, and all of a sudden they're down a level, and whatever it may be. Similarly, the coach may suffer injuries or may have other things come up that affect what they've got control over. But I think the similarity that they both have is that they both can only control those things that they can control. And one of those things that I think has become more and more clear to me over time that I think separates great leaders from others who are okay or terrible. But the great leaders, I think, figure out that everybody's an individual and they don't treat everybody the same way. Now, if I'm the CEO of a huge organization, or if I'm the head coach of it, I may not be able to get to know each and every player, each and every member of the organization well, but I can get, hopefully, my direct reports or whatever it is, dig into that enough, or at least appreciate that everybody's wired differently. I can treat them all fairly. May or may not mean I treat everybody the same because different people are wired differently. And so I think that's one of the things that we see from great leaders. And I know I'm not exactly getting at your question of the difference here, but I do want to bring out that point because I do think we're more effective when we realize that people have certain things that they respond to, and not in a manipulative way, but just understanding that there are certain people that respond better to encouragement. I think all of us need encouragement, by the way, but certain people respond better to encouragement. Other people who maybe are more experienced or maybe have been through different things or maybe they're wired differently, I can just go, hey, what was that? That's not how we need to do this. And they're like, yeah, you're right. Whereas somebody in a different spot in their life, I may need to put my arm around them and say, hey, that's not what we're looking for here. Let's try to figure out a better way we can do that and how we get across that and how they're going to respond. And because at the end of the day, leadership is simply influence, right? And so how are we going to influence somebody? How are we going to help them? And so I think by understanding that person and what makes them tick and what's going to be most effective is the best way. So I didn't exactly answer your question. In fact, I didn't answer it at all, I don't think. But I think at some level, they both have to control what they can control, and that they've got different areas that they're able to do that with.
Something that's kind of changed since when you were most involved with the world of football has been the introduction of NIL, name, image, and likeness, allowing college athletes to make money off their name, image, and likeness through brand deals on social media and also now being paid directly through the universities. Do you think this is a healthy development for both the athletes and for the colleges and enables a fair way for colleges to play the game? Or do you think that this is a mistake and that this is going to lead to focusing on things that shouldn't be focused on in the game of college sports?
So as a fundamental matter, I do think that paying people for their labor is appropriate. It just seems like a fundamental thing that we do in so many other areas. And the days in which college sports were, hey, you play with the folks who come to your school and I'll play with the folks who come to my school and we'll have a PE teacher coach them up. That those days are so far behind us, right? Yeah. And when Coach Spurrier was at Duke, Coach Spurrier made $60,000 a year and a Duke scholarship was $30,000 or something. So you look at that and you think, okay, that, the coach is making kind of twice what the players made. And not that the players made it, but, now you've got these college coaches making $6 million a year or whatever, and when I wrote Tim Tebow's book, he had he had a line in it that he told Coach Meyer before the national championship game. He said, because this, of course, is pre-NIL, and Tim said to Coach Meyer, he said, I hope I play well enough tonight that you make a lot more money. And Coach Meyer and I were laughing about that the other day, going, yeah, how's that fair, right? How is that fair that if Tim plays really well, I'll make even more money? So that's a fundamental matter. I think we've completely butchered it. I think the NCAA has not thought through, or really was never proactive in figuring out a good way to do this. I think the system works very poorly. I think when coupled with the transfer portal, creates incentives for players to leave and players to chase short-term gains, which I can't say I wouldn't have done at the age of 18 or 19 or 20. But I don't think it sets them up for making what sometimes might be the best decision for them. And so, and not that coaches make the best decision, right? I mean, they get offered what feels like a lot of money and they leave one situation. We've got plenty of those situations. We can look back at coaches and think, why did he leave X school or X team and go to Y? I mean, so coaches do it too, but I think it's particularly challenging for players at their age to navigate that and then be able to just say, well, times have gotten tough here, or this isn't what I expected and I'm going to leave, is also a challenge and not always in people's long-term best interest. So I like the concept of people being paid for their labor. I don't think we've figured out a very good solution here for it. So I don't have the answers, though, beyond that.
So while you give your talks mostly based on topics such as resiliency or other ways to impact organizations, institutions, groups of people, I'm sure you get lots of questions both after the talk is finished and emails, DMs, etc. online. Is there any, or are there any particular questions that come to mind that you wish people would ask you but never do?
One of the ones that does come up occasionally, but not as often as I would think, is when I speak on team building at times. And I'll talk about team building and that to have a high-functioning team, a high-performing team, we really all need to maximize our role, whatever our role is on that team, whether it's a backup player or a sales manager or a receptionist or the president of the company, whatever it is. We need to be as good in that role as we can. And so there are times when you talk to somebody and they're the receptionist and they're like, I don't want to be all that chipper on the phone because people are going to think I love my job and I don't want to be the receptionist forever. And so I don't want to be a great receptionist because I don't want to be pigeonholed to do that forever, or whatever it may be, right? If we're a backup player, we don't want to necessarily we want to be the starter. So there were times when I was in college and I wasn't really always helping the starters get better because I was so busy focused on how I could get better and take their place. And now that I've gotten older and thought through it and realized, you know what, there's something to be said for being really good at our role, at owning it, at being good at it, but having candid conversations. Hey, to whoever's up the ladder, hey, I would love to move into sales. I don't want to be the receptionist forever. But I understand that I am the front-facing person in this company, that this is their first contact with the company, whether it's at the desk or on the phone. And so I'm going to be great at it. But please understand, can we talk again in 6 months or in a year or whatever? Or as a backup player, hey, look, I will help the guys in front of me get better, the ladies in front of me, whatever it is, I will help them get better. But someday I want to be the starter, right? And if that's not going to be here, then can we figure out a way that it could be elsewhere or at another position? Or is there some other way I can help or whatever it may be? So to figure out a way that we can be really good at our role and not necessarily buck our role or fight it, but then be really good at it with the understanding that this isn't where I want to finish. Now, there may be times when you say, this is it. This is the role I want, and I'm comfortable here, and I'm going to be really good at it, and I'm going to be great and move on, and this is what I'm going to do for the next 40 years. But a lot of us want to do something else, something different. We want to grow. We want to move. And so I think there are not enough people who are willing to say, I want to be great at this, or I'm willing to be great at this, but let's have a conversation. And because I don't want to lock myself into this by being good at it forever.
It's a really good perspective, and I've definitely thought about the perspective of getting better, but not really as the directive getting there. And I think that's really interesting with regard to the topic on NIL, or even your receptionist example, it's like, I'm willing to do what it takes right now. I'm willing to be the best I can in this position for the goodness of the organization, but know that this is where I want to be. And that's how you create an organization and remove toxicity, because they've got to know that, hey, sometimes you've got to be a team player, but know that in time will elevate you as an individual.
Right. And having the wisdom at times in the conversation to say, I'm getting offered, in the NIL, I'm getting offered $2,000 a year more to go wherever. And to be able to sit down with a coach and have the coach hopefully be somebody you trust and somebody who says, okay, great. If you need to take that, if you want to take that, I get it, whatever the number may be. But if you stay here, here's what the future could look like here. Maybe you never make, maybe you're short financially over what you could have made by going, but here's going to be some other opportunities. Here's some ways we can help you grow. And whatever it may be. I talked to a college baseball coach and he said, look, I'm going to lose players at times, right? They're going to get offered more money. They're going to get offered a chance to go in the Major League Baseball draft, whatever it may be. But I want to create a climate where they know that they're cared for. They know that I love them. And at least it stings on their way out the door, that they're like, hey, I am going to go and do this other thing that's going to be good for me. But wow, that was a really cool year, 3 years, whatever it was I spent there in among people who really cared about me. And he said, at the end of the day, if that's all it is, that's okay. But that may be the best I can do, is to really kind of embrace them, love them, try to grow them in whatever their opportunities are here, and hopefully make the most of those. But if it's not enough, it's not enough, and I can only do what I can do.
Do you have a favorite story from your speaking that you like to tell?
So I have one that comes to mind is a Chicago Bulls story. I've now mentioned Billy Donovan and Michael Jordan, so I'll stick with the Bulls and talk about Stacey King. Stacey is a great story when it comes to this idea of roles and being on a team. And Stacey was on the first of the Jordan three-peats, where the Chicago Bulls won 3 championships, and Stacey was an integral player on that. Played at the University of Oklahoma and then for the Bulls, and there was a game in which Michael scored 69 points against the Cleveland Cavaliers, still a Chicago Bulls record. And after the game, reporters were all crowded around Jordan's locker to ask him about the game. And one reporter decides, well, everybody's going to have Jordan quotes. Let me go find somebody else. And he wanders down the row of lockers to Stacey King's locker. And he says, Stacey, tell me about tonight. Tell me about being a part of that game where Michael Jordan scored 69 points. And Stacey says, I will always remember tonight, because tonight is the night that Michael and I combined to score 70 points. And of course he had one, right? And Stacey he's now a broadcaster for the Bulls. He still tells this story. But he had 1 point. And so I asked him, I was with him a couple years ago, and I said, I've heard this story. Is this true? And he said, yeah, I said that. And I said, did you not have an agent or family members or friends who said, you got to score more, you got to shoot, you got to whatever? And he said, I did. They told me it was, my agent said I'm going to get paid more if I score more, and I needed to shoot more. And he said, I looked at all them and said, I'm in the NBA. I'm winning championships, and I'm going to win championships, and I'm going to stick as a member of the Bulls if I get rebounds, if I give the ball back to Michael, if I play good defense. And nowhere is scoring going to be a part of what makes me valuable to the Bulls. And so he said, yeah, it would have been fun to score 20 points a game or whatever. He said, but my role was to get the ball back to Michael. And so he played whatever it was, 13 years in the NBA, averaging 5 points a game. But he knew his role, and his role was that. And he realized that, this is a role I can do well, and I can play this for a long time. And then, of course, he just had a great mindset and attitude toward it. So I just really thought that was a valuable thing.
And how do you find that most people respond to your talks? And have you noticed like the impact or implementation of your ideas? Because I feel like it's one thing to, go to a talk and be like, that was interesting, and move on with their lives. But I feel like it's another thing to actually take something, make a note of it, and then work to actually implement it, in their lives and their career and what they're doing. Have you noticed much implementation and impact from your talks?
Well, initially, the initial response I get is weeping, gnashing of teeth, people throwing things. They're so excited to be there, just cheering. No, I'm just kidding. Sometimes it's hard to tell, right? You do get feedback, and you get a sense at times with emails you get or or responses you get, people asking questions. But I do think I try to provide several takeaways, several short, clear things that people can take away and implement. And then they can connect with me on social media and the like. So sometimes I do get a chance to get feedback directly, but a lot of times I'll get feedback sometimes from the organizers, or then I'll just try to really kind of tie into what they're already trying to do. I have topics I often speak on, whether it's team building, leadership, resilience, building a culture, how to help people change, different things like that. But I always try to tailor it to what the organization's already doing. And so spoke at a credit union not too long ago, and new CEO said, I have these 3 points that I'm trying to implement as I take over the organization and move us. And so made sure that those kind of became my 3 points and that they were part of what the stories I had kind of made sense, but then also being able to just give them the tools then to move forward. Similar with coaches, trying to figure out the language they use and the takeaways so that I can check back in with the coaches and they can say, yeah, that was helpful to get, this story and that story, or the players heard it from a new voice that wasn't always me. But it is sometimes hard to get that feedback and know if you made a difference. Tony Dungy will still send me notes. People will send him cards and stuff. Hey, I read your book and I got this from it. And so, some of our books came out. Our first book came out 18 years ago this year. And we'll still get cards. And Tony will still forward me cards and say, hey, can you believe we got another one? So you don't always get the feedback. I do think that's part of life, though, in general, is that a lot of times we don't hear back when we talk about why do we share with others and why do we try to help others get better. I do think that for most of us, we build into a neighbor or a friend or a coworker or whatever it may be, and you don't always hear back, right? And you just kind of wonder, like, hey, we were friends for a long time and then they moved away. And the reality is, I think if you're like me, there are times when I think back and think, oh man, I remember when so-and-so told me that story. That really applied today and that really was great in my marriage or whatever it may be. I ought to tell them that. And then, of course, I get busy and I forget and I never tell them. So I think we have to step out in faith sometimes that what we're doing makes a difference and makes an impact. And we don't always hear that. But that doesn't mean we stop trying or we give up. But to understand that we probably are making a difference, even if it's small or incremental at times. And even if people aren't falling out of their seats while we speak, laughing and crying, as I would wish the reaction would be sometimes. But just that sense of hopefully we're making a difference along the way.
I want to ask 3 final quick questions. The first of which being, over the next 3 months, year, 5 years, 10 years, however long scope you look at it, what's next for you?
So a couple of new book projects that I'm in the middle of that won't come out for another year or two. And those will be fun and exciting and take me into a different space than football. Football's been great. And that certainly is the area I worked in, but it's fun to branch out and to do some other things. And then also speaking. I've done some really fun things, traveled around the country, gotten to do some one-offs that are always fun, to fly into a place and go to Denver, go to San Diego, whatever, give a keynote. But then it's also fun. I've done a couple of executive coaching things where I've got business clients that I speak with every week and help them work through things on. And then I've got a couple of groups, leadership groups that I've been involved with, a couple of associations, and those have been ongoing once a month for a couple of years. And so those are fun too, because you get to see some of that growth and we talked earlier about some of the implementation and you can see people grow and change, and they actually give me feedback. And I think, okay, you know what? I can do this differently next time, that I've thought this approach worked, but maybe I can shift and do something different. So more of both of those. And then the other thing too, in keeping with the keynotes and the speaking, is I've spoken in Thailand twice, Croatia, looks like I'll be going to China in the next year. And so those are fun too, to just have these unique experiences that come about where people seek me out from places I would have never thought to have looked for a business opportunity yet. So that's been fun too.
My penultimate question, if I was to ask someone in 100 years' time, what would you want your legacy to be and how would you want to be described?
Yeah, so first, let me just say that I love your use of penultimate. That's one of my family's favorite words. It's so much better than next to last. So we use penultimate all the time. So I appreciate your use of that.
Of course, I did my research.
I would. Well, good, good. You really talked to all the right people then about what word I love. So I would hope that people would look back and say he was a good friend and a good father, and he did the right thing. And if there's anything beyond that, and if any of my books lived on, that'd be great, or any of my talks or whatever, that'd be great. But I do think at the end of the day, you know, the old all politics are local or something like that is a phrase. I do think a lot of impact is local, that at the end of the day, most of the impacts we make are going to be in the areas around us, or at least some of the meaningful ones. And so I hope I'm doing those right, and I'm doing my best in those areas.
And my final question, I ask this to every guest on Personable, is what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
So I think one of the things that they should take away is something that I haven't even talked about yet, something that we didn't touch on. But I just read a great book called Heartbreaker by Mike Campbell, who was in Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. He was the lead guitarist for Tom, and just a fantastic book. And the thing that kept coming back in, and it's a story that I have not spoken since I read the book, but I'm going to be working it into my talk, is the concept of gratitude. And it's one that I've spoken on in other contexts, but it kept coming up over and over and over. And he kept pinching himself throughout his career. And he's playing with Tom Petty, and Bob Dylan's on stage and whatever. And, you know, he's worn out, and he would stop and go, oh my gosh, I'm on stage with my best friend, Tom Petty, and one of my boyhood heroes, Bob Dylan, is standing over there. I cannot believe I'm here. And I think there are a lot of moments in life. I'm never going to be on stage with Petty or Dylan or whatever, and I would love to be a rock star, but I have not ever worked to play an instrument, so it's my own fault, I'm sure. But I have so many things to be grateful for. And that at times like Campbell, right? I can look around, and there are other folks around him who would look around and find things to complain about. And he kept stopping and saying, oh my gosh, I can't imagine. I could never have imagined what I'm going through right now. And how cool is this? So even when I have tough times, I try to remember, hey, look, I've had these really cool opportunities, or I've had some really unique experiences, and to be grateful for that. So yes, own your role. Yes, control the controllables. Yes, be yourself in whatever your leadership capacity is. But all along the way, good times and bad, remember that there's just so much to be grateful for every day.
I've spoken to some people, and there's some other podcasters that do this, and they're just a collection of quotes, metaphors, chapters of books, and just misplaced knowledge that kind of comes out of the middle of nowhere, which has no relation to anything apart from that they read it somewhere. And I feel like you're the complete antithesis of that. I feel like your stories are organic, they're authentic, they're genuine. You genuinely seem like you enjoy telling your stories. And having not been a football fan or being that knowledgeable about it, you broke it down in a way that was very easy for me to conceptually understand. I hugely enjoyed meeting you and learning and sharing your story on Personable today. So thank you so much for coming on. And if you want to check Nathan out, please check out his website and all of his other socials.
Fantastic. I really appreciate a chance to be with you on Personable, and thanks for making this happen.
Of course.